even thinking in terms of getting to the United States anymore. They're looking, if they need to get out, if they've made that decision to leave everything behind and to commit themselves to applying for asylum, they are looking to go to Scandinavian countries or to Australia or to Canada.
This time, as new figures show legal immigration to the United States is falling, an international reporter tells me why we're no longer the world's go-to country. And as a labor shortage looms, America's industry leaders are also worried about losing the dreamers in their workforce. For some, it's about a lot more than productivity.
The DACA situation is not an immigration issue. It's a moral issue.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America. Over the weekend, news broke of a suspected chemical weapons attack on the Syrian city of Douma. According to the White Helmets, a volunteer relief organization in Syria, 40 people died in the attack, with hundreds more suffering injuries. President Trump tweeted over the weekend in response, "Many dead, including women and children, in mindless chemical attack in Syria." And a couple days later, Trump said there would be a, quote, forceful response. The horrific incident reminded me why our refugee resettlement programs are so important, to protect people fleeing war and persecution. But President Trump's travel ban prevents Syrian refugees from entering the U.S. So, as of right now, the Trump administration's, quote, forceful response does not include providing safety and refuge. Which brings me to this week's conversation. Mindy Belz is an international journalist and the senior editor of World magazine, which is read widely by evangelical Christians. She's the author of the book They Say We Are Infidels, which catalogs her experiences covering the wars in Iraq and Syria. She's also reported from Afghanistan, Africa, and the Balkans. Her stories have been published in the Wall Street Journal and the Weekly Standard. She specializes in migration and refugee issues, and I began our conversation by asking her how the president's immigration crackdown has affected the thousands fleeing wars, oppression, and poverty.
We're not just seeing a decrease in refugees coming to the United States. We're seeing an absolute chokehold. It has become almost impossible to get into this country. And when I travel, and I was just in Turkey, just in Iraq, and going around the edges of Syria, people aren't even thinking in terms of getting to the United States anymore. They're looking, if they need to get out, if they've made that decision to leave everything behind and to commit themselves to applying for asylum, they are looking to go to Scandinavian countries or to Australia or to Canada. And I think that is significant for us. It represents a huge shift in how people in some of the deepest troubled, most oppressive parts of the world think about the United States.
And how do you see your readers reacting this year versus, past years?
Differently. I think we'd have to go back and a short history I think is useful because as you probably know, Ali, the Obama administration didn't have a great record on refugees. The Obama administration really also was throttling particularly Syrian refugees. And as we saw that war pick up and just become worse and worse and worse, and it would be a whole nother podcast to talk about how U.S. policy, I believe, contributed toward just the horrific situation that we've seen in Syria, a situation that has literally emptied the country of about half of its population or displaced half of its population. We played some role in that. And then at the same time that we were stepping back from active military engagement and security engagement in that region, we also were not allowing the refugees to come into our country. And that's kind of unprecedented in terms of how the United States, what role the United States played. In other words, we weren't being the humanitarian guardian, and we also weren't being a security guardrail or safekeeper of any sort. And so the numbers got to be so low that were being allowed in under the Obama administration. You actually had Republicans in Congress pushing the Obama administration and embarrassing it, in a sense, on their poor humanitarian record. And so in about 2014, early 2015, the Obama administration raised its quota and then raised it dramatically to 99,000 roughly refugees overall. This was a context leading into late 2015 when a couple of things happened. We began to see the rise of Donald Trump as a serious candidate and what he represented. And we also had, if you'll remember, the November attacks in Paris that were really the first time, this coordinated attack on 8 different locations in one of the largest cities in Europe, a city that many Americans are familiar with. It felt like something coming home, even to us across the Atlantic. And the Trump campaign, President Trump himself, and a number of Republicans seized on this moment to begin saying that we had to do something about immigration, both refugees and normal immigration procedures, so that we were guarded against allowing jihadists to come in with the normal flow of refugees.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think what the Obama administration did in 2013-14, whether it was Syria or even Central America, the way that from a policy perspective and even from a communications perspective, that was the beginning of really a cratering of public support for the idea of refugee resettlement, much less immigration.
Syrian refugees began to be almost code language for terrorists. And yet I had been in Syria, I had been in the camps, I had seen just these people were encountering some of the most unbelievable atrocities in my lifetime. And I think we could argue since World War II under Hitler, Christians were being dragged out of their homes. Families were being forced to watch while their sons and their husbands were having their heads cut off and having their heads hung on fences in public squares. It was meant to terrorize the whole population. And it was in the midst of this happening that we were saying no to the people who are fleeing this kind of carnage. And you asked the question about our audience. I think both our audience at World was sort of representative of what was happening, at least among a lot of conservatives and a lot of even within the Christian community, the language and the perspective began to change. And refugee no longer meant someone who we needed to help. It meant someone we needed to keep out.
And what I've come to believe is that, as immigration advocates, the National Immigration Forum, for so long, our talking points ended at the border. I would only talk about border policy. I wouldn't necessarily talk about global migration. But I think what's happening is that a family in the middle of America, they're watching the news and they see that set of Syrian refugees fleeing violence and persecution, and they believe that family is going to be their next door neighbor next week. And we as advocates do nothing to really help the public understand what are the dynamics of global migration. Why are people moving? Why do people want to come to the U.S.? The column that you wrote that really caught my attention was those Hebrew midwives. And when you wrote, when compromise is unthinkable, we are led to believe there are only 2 sides to any issue. Soundbite culture turns a deaf ear to complexity, yet most issues that are important are also complex, like immigration. So as an advocate, we need your advice on how do we talk about these global migration issues so that conservative America doesn't see refugees and immigrants as a threat.
Well, I think that we can all relate to stories, and we can certainly relate to stories that involve mothers and fathers and children and grandparents. And that's basically what we're talking about. It's ironic that I had begun writing a book. It was coming together over a process of years about what was happening specifically to the Christians in Iraq and Syria, starting from roughly the time of the U.S. Liberation of Iraq and moving forward through the years of that war into the period when ISIS came to control parts of both countries. And one of the reasons when I was having conversations with publishers, a number of publishers were interested in this book. One of the selling points was, eventually some of these populations will be coming to live in American communities because of what's happening. And this is a book that will help prepare them, help them understand what these people have been through. And I had no idea that actually by the time the book was completed and came out, the conversation in the United States would have changed so much. No one was really talking about receiving refugee communities anymore. But I think the point still stands that understanding what these people have been through in deeper ways than what we just see on the nightly news is key to beginning to formulate policy that, that deals with the complexities, policies that deals with the tremendous crisis that we face. Because, these populations, when we say no at our borders and we don't allow them in, these populations don't just go away and disappear. They go somewhere. And if they remain, if you look at the tremendous number of young people just being in Iraq and seeing some of the people who've been displaced now for 3 and 4 years from ISIS, there are infants who have only grown up knowing a displaced lifestyle, a refugee itinerant way of living. There are 10-year-olds who are now 15 and soon will be 17 who have missed 3 and 4 years of school because of these situations. What happens to them when they become 25 and 30-year-olds with this experience, sinking deeply and lasting over a long time at the heart of their maturing years? What happens to them? What happens to them is they become most likely unhappy, destabilized populations that we're going to be dealing with in one way or another. They're going to be the next generation of jihadists. They're going to be the next generation of people who are agitating against their governments and creating even more of the kind of instability that we see across the Middle East right now. I think it's a very short term, I think it's kind of security on the cheap for the United States to think that by not allowing them in, by not having a refugee admissions program, that we're somehow doing something that benefits ourselves.
So the name of the podcast is Only in America. And of every guest, I ask the same last question to complete this sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America do we have the vast amount of natural and human resources that I believe ought to allow us to be big and expansive in our approach to the world. I don't think we have to hide from the world.
Mindy Belz is the senior editor of World magazine. For more about Mindy and her book, They Say We Are Infidels, go to immigrationforum.org. And while you're there, subscribe to Only in America.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
This is Only in America. I'm Ali Noorani. It's a shame the administration is cutting legal immigration numbers so drastically because, well, a new study from the National Bureau of Economic Research suggests that first-generation immigrants create about a quarter of new companies in the U.S., and in some states, the number exceeds 40%. Picking up on this theme, the Washington Post, in an editorial, warned of an impending crisis of labor shortages, citing manufacturing, farming, energy, food service, and a host of other industries. Silicon Valley has realized a brain drain, spurred by the immigration crackdown, will hurt American businesses and innovation. And there's a groundswell of support in the industry for DACA recipients battling to stay in the U.S. For some, it's more than economics. Here's Apple CEO Tim Cook on Recode's television special that broadcasted on MSNBC.
The DACA situation is not an immigration issue. It's a moral issue. This is a moral issue. This is one that goes to the core of who we are as Americans. Who among us would think that it's the right thing to do to kick somebody out of this country that came here when they were 1, 2, 3 years old, that have only known this country as their home, that know no other country as their home? This just doesn't make any sense.
From DACA legislation to the National Guard on the border to immigration raids, the months ahead are going to be pretty busy as we move into the midterm elections. Republicans are worried they will pay a political cost. Democrats wait to see how energized their voters are, and immigrants, documented or not, are afraid. I'm Ali Nirani. Go to immigrationforum.org for more context on all things immigration, subscribe to Only in America, and let us know what you think of the show by writing a review on iTunes. Our producers are Emily Chow and Regina Medina, and our executive producer is Kathleen Farrell. I'm Ali Nirani. Join us again, same time next week, on your favorite podcast platform for Only in America.